I'm Timothy Rich, Associate Professor of Political Science at Western Kentucky University.
And I'm Madelynn Einhorn, an honors undergraduate researcher at Western Kentucky University.
So our paper, Are They Paying Attention? A survey analysis of South Korean attention to North Korea, analyzed South Korean public attention to specifically that. How often do you, in the average week, do you think about North Korea?
And the results were pretty interesting, especially from a Western perspective, where we were shocked to find that South Koreans think about North Korea very rarely. In fact, often not more than once or twice a week.
And conventional wisdom would probably suggest that it would be much higher than that, especially based on the attention that North Korea gets in South Korean media. So we were really surprised by this. Um, we didn't find it that surprising, however, that if you knew a North Korean or you thought about unification issues, things of that nature, that you were more likely to think about North Korea on a regular basis.
So basically, what this helped us figure out is areas where South Koreans were paying attention to North Korea a lot, and areas of public demographics where people really weren't thinking about North Korea despite repeated news coverage of the issue.
So one thing that sticks out, for example, is that older South Koreans are more likely to think about North Korea, which makes sense if you remember the authoritarian era, if you perhaps even remember the war or the immediate after-war period. But a lot of the other demographics really didn't have much of an influence.
So we sort of turned to some additional attitudinal factors. And as Dr. Rich already said, knowing a North Korean was something that significantly corresponded with thinking about North Korea, as well as thinking about unification a lot or believing unification will happen in one's lifetime. So these attitudinal factors simply basically told us that people who are really engaged in the issue of inter-Korean relations are much more likely to think about North Korea on a weekly basis.
And I think there's some policy implications here too. First of all, like if you're a South Korean leader, the results here might surprise you that how little attention is being played or being put on North Korea. But it also suggests ways that you can increase this. For example, greater efforts to connect the South Korean public to North Korean refugees in South Korea might actually increase attention. Or there are several other factors, but like you could see areas that this could have ramifications on how you interact, frankly, with North Korea.
And this also told us a lot about the important issues when it comes to South Korean politics. So, North Korea has never been, or at least in the past couple of years, a particularly large voting issue for South Koreans. So, potentially, this could kind of tell us what level of thought or, um, I guess, saliency is put into voting on North Korean
No,
issues.
I would totally agree that from an outsider perspective, you may assume that North Korea weighs heavily on the minds of South Koreans, especially leading up to an election. And frankly, domestic issues like unemployment probably matter more. I mean, you just had mayoral elections earlier this spring, and North Korea wasn't a big issue there, frankly.
Yeah, so the results are pretty interesting overall. But what's really interesting is, of course, every time we've presented this at a conference in the United States, everyone's always been shocked. But whenever we've spoken about people who've been living or in South Korea for a long time or are South Korean, they've always just thought it was kind of common sense that South Koreans rarely think about North Korea.
Bingo. I think there's sort of perceptual discrepancy here that outsiders tend to think that since North Korea is right next door, you must think about unification, North Korean refugees, all of these things all the time. When in reality, most South Koreans are busy with their everyday lives. They're concerned about education. They're concerned about how much money they make, where they can live, things of that nature. So I think this really exposes sort of those misconceptions that are often common about inter-Korean relations.
Well, I think that, about wraps up all of our paper. I think it was some pretty interesting findings, and I hope that anyone watching is interested in reading more.
And I would agree. Thank you very much.
Thank you.